So, the next thing that we want to talk about and that you need to always have in your game plan and in your toolbox when you play poker is to always have a plan. So, this is something that a lot of people that I've worked with in the past that they struggle with before they come into my course. They have all these different concepts and theories in poker and they apply them independently. They don't apply them cohesively. They don't apply them as an entire group of theories together. They think about them independently and they think about poker and every single action in poker as an independent entity rather than thinking about it as a holistic game from start to finish. So, for example, I'll have an opponent that is raising pre-flop and somebody 3-bets them and they call without having a plan based upon what they'll do post-flop. They decide to call. Or, for example, I'll have somebody that fires out a c-bet bluff on the flop and I'll ask them, well, what's your plan if your opponent calls? What's your plan if your opponent raises? And a lot of times they won't have a good plan. So what you need to do, and this is something that will take some time as you start to play the game, is you need to think about the game holistically from the very beginning all the way to the end. So from the inception of the game pre-flop, where either you're raising or you're calling or whatever you're doing, you have to always think about these what if scenarios. So what if my opponent does this or my opponent does that? How should I react? You should always have a plan. So always think about the what ifs and the future streets. For example, let's say you semi-bluff the flop. Let's say you have the ace queen of clubs and it is a king 10 4 with 2 clubs on the board. So you have the nut flush draw and you have the nut straight draw. Your opponent bets, you raise, and your plan is here should be, well, I am semi-bluffing here, number one, to get him to fold, but if he calls, then if I pick up more equity on the turn, then I'm going to bet. If I feel like I can get him to fold, I'm going to bet. Or if he re-raises me, then I'm just going to get it all in on the flop. So you'll notice there that I have a plan for all the different contingencies based upon if he calls, if he raises, and based upon what happens on the turn as well. So we're always thinking about the future states of the game. We're not always thinking about just immediately what's going to happen. Because if we do that, we fall into this trap of thinking in a box. And we need to think outside of this box. Because the game of poker is just not independent streets. It's not just the flop, and then the turn, and then the river. Right? It's everything. It's the pre-flop that leads to the flop, that leads to the turn, and leads to the river. And everything is interconnected. Our opponents' hand ranges are interconnected, the board texture is interconnected, and the betting and the player tendencies, all this is interconnected. So as you play the game, always have a plan, always think of it as a plan, and think of, well, when I do something pre-flop, what's my plan on post-flop based upon the board texture, my player's tendencies, our position, whoever has the initiative, and our hand values, whether it's a made hand or drawing hand, and equities and pot odds and everything. So you have to think about all these different items and all these what-if scenarios and contingencies. So always have a plan. And like I said, this is going to take time. And a lot of it just comes down from studying the game and putting in hands and having repetition time after time of studying this. I've had a lot of students that have taken my course and it was kind of like an aha moment at the end, especially my Crush Online Microstakes course where I talk about all the concepts. Because in the past, a lot of them just talk or thought about these different concepts independently and were able to apply them independently. But when you bring it all together, they started to think of the game as a holistic game and thinking about everything together. So that's what your goal is from this lecture, is as a student of the game, is start to think of the game as an entire holistic game and always have a plan for all the different what-if scenarios, right? Have a decision tree, right? If I make this action, if my opponent does this, we will go over here and we'll do this action. If he does this, we'll go over here, we'll do this, and so forth. So you're going to have a decision tree. Now, it's not always going to be perfect. You're not always going to have a hand because you're going to get put in some tough spots. But you'll find that over time, once you do this, a lot of your actions are going to become pretty automatic. And this decision-making process is going to be subconscious. So that's your long-term goal. And in the end, remember, always have a plan.